For more than 30 years, the most dominant force in international hockey didn't come from Canada. It came from the Soviet Union. Their teams didn't just win, they humiliated opponents. And behind it all was one man. To many in the West, he wasn't just a coach, he was a dictator behind the bench. This is the story of Viktor Tikhonov. Viktor Vasilyevich Tikhonov was born on June 4, 1930 in Moscow. Tikhonov's father worked in a military defense factory. When the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, he signed up for the militia, despite having a deferment. He was killed in 1942 outside of Malgobek during the Battle of the Caucasus. His mother Anna worked in a metalworking shop and raised Viktor by herself. The first record we have of Viktor is at age 12, when he worked as a mechanic at a bus depot in Moscow during World War II. After the war, Tikhonov would join the CDKA Junior Sports Club, more than likely joining due to athletic promise, as well as his dad's military ties. In 1948, Tikhonov was drafted into the Soviet military. Like many athletes, he was assigned to a state-sponsored team, the Air Force Club, VVS Moscow. He would enter the VVS Moscow hockey program, showing promise as a young defenseman. He would become a part-time player for the 1945-50 season. But something else happened to VVS Moscow that year. In January 1950, tragedy struck the team. The VVS Moscow plane crashed near Sverdlovsk, killing everyone aboard. 19 people died, including most of the roster. The team's best player, Vesvol Bobarov, only survived because he overslept the flight. Tikhonov only survived because he wasn't a regular player yet. However, this team was run by Vasily Stalin. To avoid the wrath of his father, he commissioned a team of replacement players in just 2 days, going as far as finding players with the same last names as ones who died. These replacement players, along with Tikhonov, would still manage to finish 4th in the USSR Championship before winning 3 straight Soviet national championships from 51 to 53, as well as the Soviet Cup in 1952. 1953 would be the last season for VVS Moscow. With Joseph Stalin dying, Vasily was arrested and his team was disbanded. Tikhonov would win his 4th consecutive gold medal in 1954 with Dynamo Moscow, the team he would spend the last decade of his career with. He would have a small stint with the Soviet national team in 1956, before transitioning to an assistant coach in 1964 under longtime head coach and IIHF Hall of Famer Arkady Chernyshев. Tikhonov would serve under him for 4 years, including for the Soviet national team at the 1968 Olympics. After that season, Tikhonov would branch out on his own, taking his first head coaching position with Dynamo Riga. Despite being a league that was dominated by teams from major Russian cities, Viktor would turn a struggling club into one that would finish in 4th place in the USSR Championship. Riga would be the place Tikhonov began to be known for a strict, almost dictator-like style, with one former player saying, "If I ever need a heart transplant, I want Viktor's, because it's never been used." By the mid-1970s, Tikhonov had built a reputation as one of the toughest coaches in Soviet hockey. Tikhonov was a product of the Soviet system. His father died in what the USSR called the Great Patriotic War. He had served under Stalin's own son, and he believed completely in the idea that Soviet sports had to prove its superiority to the West. His first chance as a head coach of the Soviet hockey team came at the 1976 Canada Cup. With an experimental roster that lacked several star players, the Soviets would be eliminated in the semifinals by the Canadians. Despite the performance of the experimental team, Tikhonov would be named the head coach of CSKA Moscow and the Soviet national team, with his first major tournament being the 1977 World Championship 7 months later. The previous year's World Championships were an embarrassment for the Soviets by their standards. Having won 12 of the last 13 World Championships, they would go on to get silver in the tournament, losing 3 games, including one to Poland. While 1977 included some new faces like Slava Fetisov, it wouldn't result in a better medal for the Soviets, as they would take home bronze, losing to both Czechoslovakia and Sweden in consecutive years for the first time ever. Over the next couple seasons, Tikhonov would rebuild the Red Army with fresh new faces. Adding key pieces like Vladimir Krutov and Sergei Makharov, they retook their spot atop the world with gold medals in 78 and 79. Going into the 1980 Olympics, it's known how favored the Soviets were. However, not many know how their games went before the medal round versus the US. While the Americans finished second in the blue division, the red division looked very different. The Soviets finished a perfect 5-0 with a plus 40 goal differential, beating Japan and the Netherlands 16-0 and 17-4 respectively. They finished off the group stage taking out Poland 8-1, Finland 4-2, and Canada 6-4. Going into the medal round, the Soviets had little expectations for the Americans after trouncing them 10-3 2 weeks earlier. The reality is the Soviets were playing a rejuvenated USA team. Perhaps some complacency, including admittedly from Vladislav Tretiak, and the Soviets were left stunned after one period. What happened next, Viktor would later describe as the biggest mistake of my career. Tretiak always played better after giving up a goal. The decision was a result of getting caught up in emotions. After Tretiak gave up the rebound and led in the soft goal by Johnson, my blood was boiling. It was my worst mistake, my biggest regret. This loss was a great embarrassment to the Soviet Union. Even before the tournament at the state dinner held by Soviet officials, they had joked, "And don't lose to the Americans," and everyone laughed, because what a preposterous thing to say. The Soviets built their sporting system as a way to compete with the West. And to lose such a big game on U.S. soil was a wake-up call for the Soviet team. What came next was total domination. The first test was 7 months later at the Canada Cup. Despite going up against professionals again, and despite losing the round-robin game to Canada, they would come back with a vengeance in the final when the 8-1 win over a stacked Canadian lineup. Their winning would only continue throughout the early 80s, capturing 3 straight world championships, capping it off with a dominating Olympic performance in 1984, only to repeat again in 1988 in what would be the last Olympics the Soviet Union would compete in. By the late 1980s, the Soviet system itself was collapsing. Players began defecting to the NHL. The empire that Tikhonov spent his life serving was falling apart, but Viktor made sure that the impact he made on hockey wouldn't also fade into time. In 1992, the Soviet Union no longer existed, but Tikhonov still stood behind the bench. Coaching the unified team, a mix of former Soviet republics, he captured 1 final gold medal. He would coach for Russia for 1 time at the Olympics in 1994, failing to medal. He would come out of retirement in 2004 to coach the World Championships at the age of 71, remaining with CSKA Moscow for the rest of his career. He would eventually become honorary president before passing away in 2014. To many in the West, Viktor Tikhonov represented the enemy, the face of the Soviet machine during the Cold War. But regardless of politics, the results were undeniable. Through discipline, control, and an uncompromising system, Tikhonov helped build one of the greatest dynasties in the history of hockey, the impact of which is still being seen today.